Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Julia Zimmerman, and I serve as the Program Officer for Education, Leadership, and Engagement here at the Center for Community Progress. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., and I encourage you to share your name and where you're signing in from in the chat. Community Progress webinars equip participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's webinar, we are joined by Matt Kreis, Christopher Smith, and Allison Goldie. Matt Kreis is the General Counsel at the Center for Community Progress. In addition to serving as in-house counsel for the organization, he brings 2 decades of experience in local government and the nonprofit fields to help communities identify and reform the laws and policies that touch vacant properties. Pragmatic and empathetic, Kreis is the leading voice in national issues touching code enforcement, delinquent property tax enforcement, land use and land banking, and general municipal and real estate law. Christopher Smith co-directs LISC Jacksonville's Family Wealth Creation Initiative and creative placekeeping efforts to advance economic growth in urban core neighborhoods. He has over 25 years of experience in philanthropy, public sector, and neighborhood revitalization. Allison Goldie is the Executive Director of the Chatham County City of Savannah Land Bank Authority, Inc., and Vice President of the Georgia Association of Land Banks. Goldie's been involved in land banking for over 27 years and serves as a resource to cities and counties throughout Georgia in the field of land banking, neighborhood revitalization, and affordable housing. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, type your question into the chat box. We will share presentation slides and a video recording of today's presentation in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at jzimmerman@communityprogress.org. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt.
Good afternoon. I hope everybody's doing really well today. And thanks for joining us a little bit. I think Julia gave a great intro. I'm really excited for everybody here to get the chance to hear from Christopher and Allison, who are just doing some excellent work around these issues. But I'm going to take a little bit of time before we dive in to just sort of set the stage for, why community progress is sort of, elevating these issues and how it intersects with our focus area, which is helping communities to address vacant and abandoned properties. So next slide. So this is the type of property that we at Community Progress work with all of our partners on helping to address across the country, right? We understand the physical, mental, and financial impact this property has on neighbors. Want to elevate the fact that this is an issue felt so much more predominantly Black communities as well as other communities of color. We also understand the significant public costs it takes to make these properties safe, right? And to try to untangle years of public liens and other debts associated with it, and ultimately to work to get this back to being an asset for neighbors in the community. That's a big focus of our work at Community Progress. It's an important and critical work, but this property, like so many other properties like it across the country, in rural communities, suburban communities, and urban communities, also has a history. And it's one that we really need to identify. We need to understand, both in our efforts to address what it has become immediately and to identify what might be done to prevent other properties like this from becoming that way in the first place. So we're here today to talk more about heirs property and what that means. For now, I just want to take a moment to think about this property again and remember that this home has a story, a specific story. For our purposes right now, I just want folks to kind of imagine, right, that your grandma or your nana used to live there, right? And your mom or your dad and their siblings were raised there, used to play on the porch as a kid. But grandma or nana got sick and she passed away. She didn't have a will or an estate plan. Your dad and mom and their siblings pretty much assumed they knew they owned it, but they'd all moved out eventually and they meant to take care of it, but it wasn't really ever anyone's top priority. Over time, there were a lot of things that got harder and harder to keep up with. The roof was leaking, all these other things. The tax bills were piling up. And one of your aunts, right, maybe tried to apply for some kind of a grant to make some repairs, but she was denied because she didn't have the right paperwork. A couple of your parents' siblings passed away, and you think their kids might have some interest now, but you aren't really sure. Eventually, you all just kind of stop going there, and it begins to look a little like this. Next slide. or maybe it becomes this, right? Next slide. So what is this heirs property and how is it associated with those properties? So I think most folks generally get that when you pass away, your property typically passes to your next of kin, to your heirs, right? Your family members. A lot of folks may have a will or an estate plan that sort of guides what those next steps are going to be. So how do we figure out how the property, who does the property go to? How much of that property goes here and there? When there's no will or estate plan, or if nobody takes any further action after that plan that's laid out in the will or the estate plan, like recording a deed or something, then that often becomes what we refer to as heirs property. It's owned in this different limbo. So I'm going to start by continuing on this definition by talking about some key terms on the next slide here. Right? Ownership is a really important piece of what we're going to be talking about today. When a property does pass to an heir without any of those things happening, they still have the right to possess, the right to use the property. Title, however, is a little bit different. It's more of that proof that you have this legal ownership. And that's used, you prove title through deeds or other types of docs recorded on the thing with the county register of deeds. I just want to, estate planning, I use that term. That means up all the various things. When I use that term, I mean, it's all the various things like making a will, or maybe it's setting up a trust that help to manage the finances or a property when somebody passes away. Most people know what a will is. It's the most common way to document this person's wishes for how their property is distributed. And then probate, I'll mention that. Probate in many cases is needed. It's a legal process for reviewing all those documents and everybody's interests, and then saying, all right, you're going to get this, you're going to have to record this deed, you're going to do this. And that's a court process usually. And I'm doing this all at a very high level just to get some of these key terms in a common understanding. When you have heirs property, next slide, and when somebody passes away and there isn't a clear title, you have ownership, but because all these other things are missing, we have this title that we don't really have strong proof of the title, right? We don't have really strong proof of it. And again, I want to be very clear. I am not one of the hundreds or thousands of lawyers across the country who do this work for families on a regular basis. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I think trying to get these terms to a place where we can all kind of understand them. But the key here is that you may own it as an heir. You may own some portion of that property as an heir, but in a lot of cases, there's no ability to prove who owns what percentage, and that creates a lot of problems. Next slide. Why do we have clear title? It's a really unstable form of ownership when you don't have that proof. It's vulnerable to a whole lot of predatory actions. There's a ton of amazing articles, not amazing stories necessarily, but really heartbreaking stories, particularly from Black farmland, which millions of acres have been lost to partition actions and predatory actions by developers who use that vulnerability of the title and go find an heir who doesn't have any real knowledge or understanding of it and uses their need for money to try to get an in and force a partition or a sale of it so that they can get it cheap. It's vulnerable to tax foreclosure, right? Property taxes get expensive. A lot of family members got to figure out who's paying it. So it's really vulnerable without that clear title and understanding of who owns it. Clear title proves that the property is free from other legal claims. It gives you the ability to secure title insurance, which is so important for being able to get things like a loan or a mortgage, to secure financing, or to be able to qualify for certain grants or maybe some low interest loans to help do some home repairs. A lot of property tax relief programs require you to show clear title and home ownership to be able to qualify for them. In many cases, it can limit you from selling or transfer the property. So it creates a whole host of other issues as to why clear title is so important. Next slide. Right? And as time passes on, it just gets more and more complicated without that resolution. Maybe some heirs pass away, they leave it to their kids, and before you know it, you've got multiple owners, and the ownership is fractured across a lot of folks, some of whom may be local, some of whom may be all over, and it gets harder and harder and more expensive to resolve. Usually requires a lot of specialized searching. It usually requires a lot of specialized legal expertise, of which there are a lot of great lawyers and organizations out there that help families try to figure some of this out. But that gets complicated, more complicated until the next slide. leading many families forced to make the choice to simply walk away. Just want to put out there that conservative estimates from a lot of great research out there found that there's at least 500,000 residential heirs properties across the nation, though I'd heavily emphasize the phrase conservative estimates. There's others estimates looking at all property types, and they found 500,000 heirs properties in the South and Appalachia alone. As I mentioned earlier, it disproportionately affects Black landowners in the South due to the legacy of slavery and racist land ownership laws. In fact, the Center for American Progress estimates that Black landowners lost about 90% of their rural and agricultural land between 1910 and 1997. Hundreds of billions of dollars of lost wealth. Next slide, please. So, what can we do about it? In our world in community progress, we do a lot of work with local governments, with land banks, with other nonprofits and other community groups and folks too, right? And so what we've been trying to do is figure out many of the different ways in which folks can do a lot to sort of help other folks, all these families that are trying to resolve these issues, right? And while we come to this work from, I don't want to say the back end, but where that property has already become vacant and abandoned. Those tools to put those properties back to good use are still really important, but we want to urge our partners at the local government nonprofit level to think more about how far upstream they can go and invest in their resources to prevent these properties from sliding down this path in the first place. And so a great deal more is going to need around education, letting people know the consequences of what this type of ownership can have. And I want to be clear, not every property that is an heirs property is a problem. It is not. Many families do this and they own it and it works for them. They're taking care of the property, all of that. Just because it's owned by some heirs and they haven't resolved all those title issues does not mean it looks like the property in the past thing. And I want to stress that. But it does mean that it's an unstable form and so of ownership, and there are risks. And so education around how they can mitigate that, whether or not wills and estates can do so. Analyzing data, taking a good chance to really taking a good look at what's out there. Local governments can help think through what else is out there how can we get a better handle on the scale of this issue? How many people do we need to be supporting? Things like that. And I know Chris from LISC is going to talk a lot about some of these two things a little bit too. Home ownership benefits, thinking through how we can change certain programs and laws to help heirs qualify for the benefits that home ownership usually gives you. Mentioned earlier, property tax relief. A lot of property tax relief programs may not allow somebody who owns it in an heirship status to qualify for a reduced property tax rate, right? And Christopher just shared a great tool, has a toolkit on their website for LISC as well. There are little things we can do maybe not little, but there are things we can do to amend state law to provide more tools to be able to help resolve those. We can still retain the tools that we need to deal with those vacant and abandoned properties. We can figure out how we can use that ability either at local government or land bank level to clear title to some of these properties. And whether or not some of those public powers to help clear that title can help some of the heirs that are still there to resolve these issues in their favor. And then what Allison Goldie is going to talk about later about helping some families be able to reclaim the properties. Once they become vacant and abandoned, they lost it due to some unfortunate things. How can we do these things, right? I want to stress at this end here, we at Community Progress have a lot of expertise in a lot of these systems. We're not experts in figuring out how to resolve each of these complicated heirs property issues. There are many organizations, private and nonprofit lawyers that are equipped for and experts in that kind of work, including the Center for Heirs Property Preservation, the Georgia Heirs Property Law Center, legal aid organizations around the country, and countless others. Resolving these cases is expensive. It's timely. They need that expertise and attention to support. And there are a lot of other folks in this world who are looking at these things, the Housing and Property Rights at the Boston College Law, the Initiative on Land, a lot of academics, the National Consumer Law Center. A lot of organizations are looking at this, and I think it's really great that lots of people are bringing more attention to this, and we want to continue to be able to elevate all of that collective work that's being done and give our partners, our local governments, our land banks, our community organizations more tools to be able to help to address these problems on the back end, but more importantly, figure out how they can invest in preventing it in the first place. And so that brings us to the next slide, which will get us over to Jacksonville LISC. Let's hear a little bit from Christopher Smith. Enough with me.
Hey, thanks, Matt. I'm going to speak to a few areas we think have shown promise around trying to attack this issue. And I want to acknowledge on the front end that I know folks around the country are in different sort of places on this issue. And so some of this may seem unneeded, but I hope there's some insights that you can draw from this sort of radically practical strategy that we're attempting to um, uh, execute in Jacksonville alongside the number of partners that Matt mentioned. So if you go to the next slide, just to say off the top, just a sense of Jacksonville, sort of this issue as affecting our urban market, but it's also impacting the regional area. So the surrounding counties as well as Duval are seeing the impact of this show up, and it's overlapping with some of the other issues that affect housing, such as vacancy rates and foreclosure. So next slide, please. So this is the sort of general strategy we've tried to take, and I won't read it to you, but the gist of it is there's data to help inform the design of our interventions, and then we sort of serve as an aggregator, as an intermediary, right? We sort of aggregate resources, bring together partners, share the data, and then develop a shared understanding of what potential actions might look like and how we could support them, and do that in a manner that's consistent with the neighborhood's sort of priorities. The idea is that bottom sort of block there, ownership's preserved, equity gains accrued. And so for us, a win looks like sort of how we might help neighborhoods improve wealth as a neighborhood, but also how do we reduce the growth of heirship that may be occurring in neighborhoods. Next slide. And so as a result of some of the initial data crunching, and I want to mention our approach is a sort of three-legged stool. First is we got to find them. And so with data, and this is for my local government partners, one of the things I'd mention is the accessibility of local government data helped us understand how we can better track what we're seeing on the ground. And so this is an example. Since 2014, we've seen the growth of heirship double in relation to the growth of just property development. And so you can see it's almost 3-to-1 between 14 and 23 in terms of heirship is such a critical issue that we think if we don't address it in some neighborhoods, that it will only set the housing market, the local housing market back, because we know heirship has impacts on the regional GDP because of its impact downstream on consumer spend and on the ability of homeowners to be able to pull equity out of those homes and use it for their own purposes. Next slide. So one of the areas we're trying to attack around this notion of heirship is how do we be more aggressive, because we're seeing corporate and institutional activity in neighborhoods that have high heirship. And so the red, I call attention to that. Those are purchases of heirs properties by corporations. And so our goal is to reduce that number. And we think by reducing that number, we will help stabilize local neighborhood housing markets. And so data is helping drive where we're seeing institutional corporate activity occur. And then we're looking at our local partners to help get on the ground, share information and resources, and connect households who are vulnerable to corporate and institutional activity, help them understand the implications of that, and ultimately open up and broaden the options that they have available to them. And should they want to remain in the property, what tools and resources are available to them. Next slide. So in 2023, we reached an inflection point. And I want to mention that this is work that we're taking on. We're still at the early stage, but we saw the resolution of heirs outpace the number of new heirs cases. And that has proven to be a real game changer for us, in that it suggests that through estate planning, through access to title clearance, and free civil legal services, and most important, by engaging residents and property owners and helping them understand how to navigate this complicated process, that has helped bore fruit in terms of people's ability to be able to make decisions that are in their best interest. And so the resolution of heirs properties could look like that would mean that a property that was prior to this year may have been in ownership, may have been in someone else's name, and they were able to either go through probate or go through non-probate options and resolve that title, that tangled title issue, so that there is a consolidated title now that's showing up on the tax records. And so that's what we mean by resolved. New heirs could obviously mean that the owner record may have passed away, and that the new owner, and that could be a likely family heir, has to now go through the process of now getting title in their name. Next slide. What we've seen as a result of the data. And so I mentioned a three-legged stool. So finding these properties that are vulnerable to heirship, and then engaging residents, engaging households to help share information, provide connection to resources. And then third, so after find, engage, the third piece is preserve. And that is connecting folks to the legal services and legal resources, but also the financial resources such as tax, and Madam mentioned this, the tax arrears issue, so tax relief programs. So what we've done is help support tax certificate redemption assistance, so that an heirs household that finds themselves in tax arrears up to 2 years, we will work with them to help redeem that tax certificate so that they can now buy time to determine how they would like to proceed, whether that's going through probate or using other non-probate tools. But here you can see where the overlap with abandonment and vacant properties is clear. Heirs properties are markers and may offer up a window into other challenges that that household may face, such as lack of liquidity rather, as a result of not being able to access the equity in the home, and then code compliance and tax delinquency. And so that's been our strategy, has been to find, engage, and preserve. But some of the insights, as you can see here, we've found that have been useful. Next slide. And so I'll stop here with just one other point and say that as Matt alluded to, and he covered a number of pieces of this, we think that providing access to free civil legal support, and also thinking about, for my local government folks, thinking about expanding proof of ownership to allow heirs households to have access to all of the housing assistance programs might be another strategy to help resolve property deterioration and property abandonment. And with that, I'll stop.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And I am happy to be able to talk to you about this problem of heirs properties and how it affects us as a land bank in community revitalization, removing blight. Next slide. Next slide. So I've got some bullet points. If you'll bear with me, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what a land bank is, what we do, what our mission is. I'd like you to keep in mind that land banks are created typically under state legislation. So the legislation that we have here in Georgia might be a little bit different than the legislation in your state. But overall, land banks are public or nonprofit entities. They're created by the local government. So here in Chatham, Savannah, Georgia, our land bank is created through an intergovernmental agreement between the city of Savannah and Chatham County. And our mission is to acquire properties that are vacant, abandoned, blighted, tax delinquent. We strategically acquire these vacant properties, and we want to facilitate the revitalization of those properties. We want to put them back into a productive use. And we work with our local governments in a manner that's consistent with their local government plans and priorities. So Land Bank works in a collaborative effort with local government, We are out in the communities, so we are working with our local communities and property owners. We work with both nonprofit and private developers to assist in the revitalization of our inner city neighborhoods. We support the increase of property values for those in the neighborhood that might have been living there for decades and they have a house and they're trying to, keep that house in good condition, pay their taxes, yet they may have a vacant property next door that's bringing the value of their house down. We also strategically work to acquire properties in different inner city neighborhoods that have been declining for decades. And then we try to redevelop those underutilized properties. So next slide. So for us, our priorities are neighborhood revitalization and the production of affordable housing because there's such a need for that. And as a result of both of those, blight removal. So the Savannah Chatham County voters approved a SPLOST, which is a special purpose local option sales tax that has allowed us to commit $10 million, or the city to commit $10 million to acquire vacant properties and to bring about the redevelopment of those properties over a 10-year period. So I was really delighted. I've been working in land banking for over 25 years. I worked in Macon, Bibb County, created that land bank, and then now I'm working in Savannah. And one of our biggest problems is always having money to acquire properties. And here we have the money. So it's kind of exciting to be able to go out and acquire properties. So the city of Savannah partners with the land bank to acquire these vacant properties in support of this 1K in 10 program, 1,000 properties over 10 years. And we want to return those properties to an effective use. And our emphasis is on affordable housing. So next slide. So as a result, when we're out here identifying vacant, blighted properties, I'd just like to always emphasize that a property doesn't have to be a house to be blighted. It can actually be a lot. And if you look at the property there with the sign that says there's a no dumping fee of $500, but you see trash all around it, that property in May of 2021, a dead body was discovered on that property under a couch. Talk about pulling the neighborhood down. So I do like to emphasize that it is both the vacant properties that are just land and the ones with structures on them. The other property, the house, is kind of blown out. The windows are blown out. You see the tape around it. Actually sat across from a school in Macon, Georgia. And it was just a blight. It's like children do not need to be walking to their bus. They do not need to be out playing on the playground and looking at things like that. So those are the kind of properties that we here are targeting. We're targeting properties that aren't occupied, and we're targeting properties that we think we can turn around and revitalize and make them an asset in the community. Next. So that essentially leads us to working with heirs, because as we're identifying these properties, as we are identifying candidates for acquisition, we come across properties that have tangled titles. So in Georgia, land banks allow for greater flexibility in the terms and the conditions of transferring properties to new owners. That's important. That's really important, because typically a city in Georgia, if they have surplus properties, and it could be heirs properties, and they want to sell those properties, they have to put them out to bid. And then it goes to the highest bidder. So we don't have any way of knowing who's going to be the highest bidder, how much they're going to pay, and more importantly, what are they going to do with that property after they acquire it. So a land bank has greater flexibility in what they can do with that property. So a city can transfer a property to the land bank authority, and then the land bank has full discretion in determining the sales price of that property and setting conditions on the sale of that property. So if we want that property to be for affordable housing, then when we sell the property, we can put a condition on it that it will have an affordability clause for, say, 10 years. And we can put that in the deed as a deed restriction. So land banks are able to sell, trade, or otherwise dispose of property on the terms and conditions that are determined in the sole discretion of the authority. We are a separate authority. Our board is appointed by the city and the county that created us. So why is this important? This is important because this allows a land bank to acquire property and then be able to work with heirs to assist in obtaining marketable title to their family property. We don't have to put a property out to bid. So we can decide what we're going to do with that property. Next slide. So we will look at a property and we will decide what is the highest and best use for that property. And how does it fit in with our goals of creating affordable housing? How does it fit in with our goals of revitalizing a neighborhood that's been in serious decline for years, decades? So you see here Cumming Street. This is a street that is located in West Savannah. It's not a real long street, but it had a lot of vacant properties on it. So the city decided to use this as a test case. The majority of the properties that were acquired on this street were acquired through either an arm's length transaction. We were able to locate the owners of the properties and buy the properties outright, or they were acquired through eminent domain. I know eminent domain can be very controversial, but I don't want to be neglectful in saying that it might be a very important tool in the toolbox for helping heirs obtain clear title to their properties. When I was in Macon, the Housing Authority actually there used their eminent domain powers to acquire properties. And we actually worked with heirs when we were acquiring those properties. So the majority of the heirs did not want the property, but they could not sell the property because they didn't have good title. So they would work with us and we would do what we called a friendly eminent domain procedure, where the Housing Authority would acquire that property. They would transfer that property to the land bank. Then the land bank could work with the heir. The fair market value was paid into the court, and the heirs were able to collect what we say might be an inheritance to that property. They didn't want it. They were tired of code enforcement harassing them. They didn't live in Macon anymore. So, but they didn't have a clear-cut way of how can we dispose of this property and really get an inheritance that maybe our parents or grandparents wanted us to have by keeping this property. So that law changed as a result of a kilo case that I can't go into because of time today, but the laws became very strict, and it required those that were condemning properties in Georgia to hold the property for 20 years. So property couldn't be transferred to the land bank. So long story longer, the law changed again in 2017. And in Georgia, we're allowed, or any condemning authority, land banks don't have eminent domain powers, but condemning authorities can acquire properties that are blighted. They have to meet a very strict definition of blight. They can't just be ugly. The law literally says you can't condemn because it's not aesthetically pleasing, but it has to meet a very strict definition of coming. So the city here in Savannah used that law to acquire these properties here on Cumming Street, 6 or 7 of them. And we did have some heirs show up. They were not interested in reclaiming the property. And so they were able, when the fair market value, as determined by an appraiser and a judge, was paid into the court, to get the money for the property. Code enforcement's not calling them anymore about you need to take care of this property. They're not paying taxes on a property that they really don't have any plans for. So next slide. So as we acquired these properties, we started fulfilling our goal, transferring the properties to one of our nonprofit partners who created affordable single-family housing on the street. And so it has totally turned that street around. We're not currently using eminent domain here in Savannah. It is, politically challenging. It's not always popular, but I do think it can be a tool in the toolbox. And if you go to the RVP conference in October, there will be a panel discussion on using it as a tool. So plug for RVP. So next slide. So we started thinking, if we're going to acquire these properties and we have heirs that maybe don't want their property, I often get phone calls from property owners or heirs that say, we would like to keep our property. So can you work with us to do that? And it was kind of a no-brainer. The city of Savannah and the Land Bank Authority here were very committed to assisting heirs that have problems with their properties and their tangled titles. So if someone wants to keep a property, we are not in the business of going out there and trying to acquire properties and taking them away from a family that wants to keep the property in the family. So we decided that what we would do is, when we acquire property, and we acquire the majority of our properties at tax sale. So the properties go up for sale for delinquent taxes. We bid on them. If we're able to acquire those properties, former owners have a year to come back in and reclaim that property. If they don't come reclaim the property, then we do what's called barring the right of redemption, which would stop them from coming in. Then we do a legal procedure called quiet title action, which actually will clean up the title on that property. So what we have done is, while we're going through those barring the redemption and pursuing that quiet title action to get a good title on that property, we have decided that if we can locate any heirs that would have an interest in keeping that property, then they are going to get the first option to purchase that property. So we want to work with those heirs. They would be able to take advantage of certain programs that are offered by the City of Savannah's Housing Department and some of our partner agencies. Now, the heirs do need to have a plan for the property. What we don't want to do is acquire a blighted house and then sell it to an heir and it stays and remains blighted. So we will provide, through not just the land bank, but through the city as well as our partner agencies, technical assistance to those heirs and programs that would allow them to maybe obtain some financing so that they can actually do something with that property. Next slide. So in the interest of time, I have an example of this. Here is 618 Magazine Street. Elderly property owner. This was an elderly lady that owned this property and she passed away. There was a lien on the property through the city, and the city actually took ownership of the property. Now, the elderly lady's grandson and heirs approached the city and said they would like to acquire this property. The grandson actually lived in the property with his grandmother, and they really had a desire to be able to acquire this property. So we kind of put our heads together, and this was during COVID. It took a while to figure out how can we put something together to help this heir who really would like to have this property be able to acquire it. And we talked to all the heirs. They were all interested and they were all in support of him being able to acquire that property. Next slide. So what we did is the Land Bank Authority sold the property to the heir. And we asked him to put 10% down and gave him a 5-year loan at 0% interest. So then we worked with a partner agency, CHSA, Community Housing Services Agency here, that is a nonprofit. They manage the Savannah Affordable Housing Fund. They are a CDFI, and they also have a development arm, a subsidiary company that does development. So we partnered with them as well, and CHSA assisted this heir in looking for a contractor that would be able to rehab this house and reviewing the quotes that the contractor provided, and in assisting him with maybe trying to get some assistance in getting a rehab loan. Ultimately, CHSA provided the heir with a rehab loan through the Savannah Affordable Housing Fund at a low interest, amortized over 5 years with a balloon payment at the end of that 5 years. So the heir is able to purchase the property from the land bank. He only has to put $2,500 down. Then he's able to get a low interest loan through one of our partner agencies to rehab the house. So the house sales price was $25,000, well below what it would have sold for if it just went out to bid. And then the loan that was provided for the rehab was about $95,000. So this allowed this heir to be able to get this property, have the funds to rehab it. He's decided that he's going to rent it out. Couldn't decide whether to live in it or rent it out, but he's going to rent it out for the 5 years, which will allow him to have a steady income, rental income coming in, and he would be able to go to a lending institution to pay off the loans to the land bank and CHSA. Next slide. We worked really, really, really hard, and we finally got to closing day. So here you see our heir signing the paperwork to acquire the property at 618 Magazine Street. I didn't say it, but in the previous picture, I'm sure the neighbor next door that has been living next to this house has been boarded up for some time is also happy to see now that there's going to be progress on the house and it's going to be occupied. Next slide. And so here we are. Afterwards, we celebrate. Picture of me with the heir, house sold, picture of the heir with his family, 2 of his children, and another heir. So we consider this a success. We are early in this game, but we are hoping that we have more and more examples to show. And I rode by the house last week. There's a new roof on the house. There's some painting being done. So the renovations are definitely underway. Next slide. So we're excited. I have to say that partnership is critical to everything that we do. We couldn't do this without the assistance from the city that provides programs that allow these heirs to be able to purchase properties, have down payment assistance, funds to rehabilitate the home. We couldn't do this without CHSA that manages those funds and provides the technical assistance and oversight. So there are a lot of challenges with these heir properties. It's not easy to solve. We don't have all the answers, but the key is that we have to keep developing programs and improving on those programs, because we know that targeted community development strategies allow for the retention of intergenerational wealth. They allow for healthy, sustainable, equitable growth in our communities, and that is good for everyone. So I'm going to stop right there.
I think that this is the time now where we are going to engage in some questions from folks in the audience. And there was a lot coming in for both of you guys, Allison and Chris. So just get ready here.
Hey.
I can go ahead and start listing them. I've been kind of monitoring them as they've been going on. So if you guys are all right with that, I'll just kind of pick some of these out. And again, folks who are listening, we'll try to get to all of them. There's some good questions. Keep them coming in. Our colleagues are taking a look at those and trying to star them for our sake. But Chris, I think there's a really good question here from Justin, which is, what data do you use, or what data do you use when you use vacant rates or health data? And I'll combine that with the next one, which is Janet's question, which how do you identify heirs property? Which I think maybe we start with that one. That might be getting at the same thing.
Yeah, so Matt, this is a question on a lot of people's minds around the country, right? So I'll start with the caveat. There's no standardized nomenclature for identifying and coding heirs properties. So in Florida, we got 67 counties. There could be 67 different ways that the property appraisers or local government officials are coding and tracking heirs properties. In Duval, to answer the question directly, our property appraisers team has a method that they're using to identify heirs households by using a data query with Department of Vital Statistics. So they take the ownership data, they match it up with vital statistics data that they do a query twice a month. And where they find that someone has passed away, that the owner has passed away, then they deem that and they code that as a likely heirs household.
Yeah.
So that's an example of how we're able to now do a data dump with the public access to that data and able to get a list pretty regularly to actually identify likely heirs households.
Chris, just a question from me, just kind of add on to that, which is, is there an opportunity for there to be maybe ways to get some additional data points that might help you refine that search from some of the local government partners that might be out there, maybe either at the county level or at the municipal level?
Yeah. So one of the things here to say is that we're looking for markers that indicate likely heirs households. The larger thing from Matt is vulnerability. So what we're developing is a set of indicators that suggest vulnerability, and that could come through via some of the housing programs that are offered where there's been a denial. And so someone could be denied as a result of not being able to provide proof of ownership. And so that is a direct line to folks that we believe that are in greatest need. And so we work with our housing programs, we work with the tax collector office and the clerk of the court to help us put together a data sandwich that then enables us to be able to understand where are potential hotspots. And so we share some of that data with our community partners to do some direct engagement.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you, Christopher. And I'm going to remember data sandwich. Carry that with. I'm going to move on from the data question. And there's a question from both Steve Barlow and Leigh Kotwitz. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing anybody's name, by the way. I think it'd be helpful, Chris, to kind of talk about how LISC might help to support some of the financial support to help folks figure out how how are you providing that support through grants, through loans? How are you help provide connecting people with the legal resources to resolve that title?
Yeah, and if Steve's in Memphis, then I'm well aware of the work they're doing there, which is tremendous.
Yeah.
We looked at the St. Louis model through the folks at the Legal Services for Eastern Missouri to answer the question directly. It is a grant. There is no, it is not a loan to the heirs household. We make the transaction directly to the tax collector office. And so we understand what the tax arrears at that moment in time is. And then we work with that household to come up with a financial plan. And so it's not just about satisfying or redeeming the tax certificate, but it's just coming up with a game plan so they won't find themselves in that situation again. So there's a housing and financial counseling element to the transaction that's been successful. We've done that, Matt, in collaboration with our HUD certified housing counseling programs in Jacksonville. So the direct answer, it's a payment made it's a transaction directly to the tax collector's office.
Sure.
And it is paired with counseling assistance with that household.
That's excellent. That's awesome. I think, Chris, I'm going to switch over to Allison here. Allison, there's a whole lot of really good questions in here on sort of your thought. And again, one of the ways I think that people could talking about is how are you acquiring the property, which I think you answered after some of these questions were answered, right? Through direct negotiation or purchases, other things like that. Can you share a little bit about why or why not the delinquent used eminent domain? I think somebody mentioned in here, like, do you not get clear title through the tax enforcement process?
Okay.
How's that a challenge?
Well, in some circumstances, we do. If there's an in-rem foreclosure done, which is a foreclosure against the property and not necessarily the property owners, and we purchase that property at a tax sale through an in-rem foreclosure, there's a 60-day right of redemption, and then after that, we get clear title. Here in Savannah, our tax commissioner does not use the in-rem foreclosure process very often. So when we acquire that property, all we are acquiring is just an interest in the property for the taxes we paid and the cost of the sale. And so we do not have clear title to that property. So in most circumstances, when I'm buying properties at a tax sale, I don't have good title. So, but we do acquire properties through an arm's length transaction. We have actually acquired some properties with bad title, and then we go on to clear those up through a quiet title action, donations. We can acquire properties on all different kinds of ways. But,
awesome. No, that's really helpful. And I just wanted to illustrate that too, that, the tax foreclosure pipeline for land banks is obviously, as you know, we at Community Progress talk about, is a huge, the predominant way that most land banks will get property, but there are other creative ways that land banks can go about doing it. And of course, there's got to be funds to be able to help support that.
Right. Right. And there's got to be funds to clean up the titles on them. So that's the thing is whenever we're negotiating or when we're bidding on a property, we have to take into consideration that we probably got to add at least another $8,000 to clean up the title on that property.
Yeah. Well, leads to a next question from Donna, which is what process do you go through to notify heirs and how much time is generally allowed for a response?
We are saying 6 months. When we get that property and we bar the right of redemption and we start a quiet title action, if we buy it through the tax foreclosure sale, then we immediately, the attorneys that are actually working on those quiet title actions for us, we ask them as they go through that process, as they're doing their title work, will they notify us of any heirs? And sometimes I get heirs that come forward. We also place a huge sign on the property, a huge sign that says, we have acquired this property at a tax sale. Do you have any information? If you do, please call us. So I've actually had folks call me in the neighborhood and say, I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I know who owns that property or who used to own that property. I'll get in contact with them or I'll give you their contact information. Mm-hmm. So they're getting it it's advertised in the paper. Letters are sent. It's posted on the property, not in a little sign, but a big sign in red. So, we would prefer to be able to find these owners and get the properties back into their hands if possible.
Allison, also on that point, Tawny Fancy had asked if even there, why did you have to buy the property? But I guess the question that I would want to take out of there is what exactly are the loans that, in the example on Market Street that you just shared, like what is that owner paying for? It sounds like mostly the renovations and the costs of acquisition. Can you share a little bit more about what the costs of those loans cover?
Yes. And it's honestly, each property is different and each situation is very different. And we have a very innovative housing department that can get very creative. So we look at each one differently and we look at the needs of those heirs. Mm-hmm. So honestly, right now, when we're acquiring a piece of property at a tax sale, we're paying well above what the bid amount is. So there are excess funds that go into the court, and an heir can go and request those funds and get those funds and then use those funds to acquire their property back. So that's one thing that we're working with an heir on right now. The city has down payment assistance. They have the Savannah Affordable Housing Fund, which provides like I said, in my example of 618 Magazine Street, low interest loans, we can set lower interest loans at like 2%. We might, if it's an elderly person getting their property back, we might do a deferred loan for 20 years. They may never make a payment on that loan. It may be deferred for 20 years unless they sell the house in that 20-year period. That's incredible. So a lot of different creative ways of doing it, but we look at each heir individually and their needs.
I love the creativity, Allison. Thank you. Chris,
hey.
There's a good question in here too about is it worthwhile to preemptively reach out to persons from Mr. Rex McGroder that reside in areas where air properties are common? Does this process work better by actually identifying air properties? Can you give a little bit more on the work that LISC has done to do some outreach in some of those communities in the Jacksonville area?
So the short answer is yes, it does help to be preemptive because we're competing with corporate institutional activity in those very same neighborhoods. So the we buy homes for cash, the reverse mortgage industry, no disrespect to any of those players, but we think that we can generate better outcomes by helping keep the homes in the family and helping generate or provide a pathway to transfer those properties to heirs so they can provide opportunities for housing stability. So yes, we're looking at neighborhoods that have multiple stressors, Matt. So where we see high rates of foreclosure, where we see high rates of vacancy, where we see a concentration of low to moderate income households, low value neighborhoods, or all neighborhoods where there are likely to be heirs prevalence. And so it's not an exact science, right? This is more about just giving us some direction and then providing the information and helping folks make the connection when they feel there's an opportunity for them to actually do something for their property.
That's great. One last question for the both of you. Chris, we'll start with you too, that I really like. This person took a version of my own on this, which is if you could give just a quick overview. Daniel Cunningham asks, can you delineate who should comprise a team working on heirs issues? What types of departments, entities, attorneys? I love that question. If you could just, I mean, Christopher, I know you got a lot of people there, but if you each could just kind of talk through, like, you've already kind of hit on a lot of them, but if you could just kind of summarize some of those key partners that you're looking to work with, I think that would be really helpful for folks.
Yeah, so one would be, you've got to have somebody from records, whoever that is, right? So if that's clerk's office, property appraiser's office, I'd have someone who can give you an understanding of where likely heirs households are, the sizing of the challenge. Second is you need to have a relationship with someone that's going to be able to help you with transactions, whether it be tax arrears, whether it be loan creative products, but I would say someone from your housing division is critical. Then you need some credible, trusted community messengers, people that are embedded in these neighborhoods, that have lived experience, that have charisma, like you, Matt, that can go in and just talk about this thing, and they're going to be believable. They're going to win the conversation, right? And then last, I think you've got to have some financing and partners with access to capital, because the way in which this is going to happen is it's going to have some creative financial tools that are non-extractive that you're going to have at the ready to help resolve the immediate issue, whether it be taxes or probate.
Allison?
Well, Chris took some of mine, but I would add to that list that we have to have attorneys engaged to kind of interpret what those title reports look like and who those heirs are. And that might be through legal aid. That might be through our land bank attorney. That might be through a city attorney. So we're going to need some legal advice on how best to clean up that title for us. And I think the private market, because one of the things that we have here and take advantage of is actually our Savannah Affordable Housing Fund. And so that, our local hospitals contribute to that fund, and that allows us to provide some of these programs. And I think education overall is most important, because we need to educate everybody why this is important, even if they're not living in these neighborhoods. We need to educate everybody why it's important for us to have clear titles, and why it's important to our local government partners. We have to have them and their support as well to use some of these tools.
Allison, Chris, thank you guys so much. I know we're bumping up at the very end here, just to illustrate. Chris and Allison and all of their teams and the communities they're working with are doing such incredible work. These are just a couple examples. There are tons of people doing tons of things out there. We just put out a progress point on some of the things that we're following and how we look at this issue a little bit. It's not listed here, but I think there's great work. Christopher mentioned the Legal Services of Eastern Missouri is doing some really excellent work in the St. Louis and surrounding areas around helping folks with that. We know that counties, we haven't really talked about counties and county treasurers and probate courts and how they can work together on programs like the Homes for Generations program in Washtenaw County. Again, I'm just teasing these things so that you come back to us and continue to learn more from our partners, or if they're given a platform somewhere else, other places. There are great resources out there. There are great people doing a whole lot of stuff. NCLC has a publication. Pew Charitable Trusts has some stuff out there. The Mississippi Center for Justice and Heirs Property Preservation. Again, just a lot of shout outs to a lot of people doing great work. I hope this has been helpful to our partners just to kind of tee up some of these issues. And we look forward to continuing to learn from all of you and to continue to work with all of you to kind of help figure out how we can continue to bring attention and drive resources to this challenge and help communities figure this tough issue out. So thanks to Allison and Christopher and Julia.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone. This was a really great webinar. One last shameless plug to register for the Reclaiming Vacant Properties Conference, which has early bird registration ending on April 1st. If you like this conversation, there's going to be a ton of other things like it there. So we hope to see all of you in St. Louis, and we hope to see all of you back in August for our next webinar. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.